My name is Vera Collins, and if you had met me years ago, you probably wouldn't have noticed anything special about me, because I had already learned how to make myself small, how to stay quiet, how to exist without taking up too much space in my own home, because in my family, love didn't go to the one who deserved it. It went to the one who cried the loudest, and my younger sister Lily had mastered that long before I understood what it meant. She could cry at the perfect moment, say the right words, twist any situation just enough to make it look like I was the problem, and my parents never questioned it. Not once. I remember being 11 years old, running home with a blue ribbon in my hand, after winning a science competition. I was breathless, excited for once, believing maybe this time they would really see me. But the moment I stepped into the kitchen and tried to tell them, Lily walked in crying, and just like that I disappeared again. My mother's arms left me to comfort her. My father barely looked up, and I stood there holding proof that I mattered to no one, and that was the moment something inside me quietly changed. I stopped expecting, I stopped asking, I stopped believing that love in my family would ever reach me, because every time I needed something, Lily needed more, and somehow she always won by 14. I had learned how to shrink so completely that my own achievements felt like secrets I wasn't allowed to share, and when I got accepted into a summer science program, a full scholarship, something I had worked for years to earn, it ended the same way. Lily cried, my parents hesitated, and I gave it up. Because family came first, except in our house that meant I came last, and by the time I turned 15, I wasn't for set it. Just quiet anymore. I was invisible, at least until something went wrong, because when something broke, when money disappeared, when rumors spread somehow, it was always me, and every time I tried to defend myself, I was met with the same disappointment, the same tired looks, the same quiet judgment. While Lily stood there watching, sometimes even smiling like she was learning how far she could go, and the truth is, she learned quickly. She learned that she could do anything, and my parents would still believe to her. So I stopped fighting, because what's the point of telling the truth when no one wants to hear it? I told myself I just had to survive a little longer, just until I could leave, just until I could build a life somewhere else, where I wasn't the problem. But life doesn't wait for you to be ready for the moment that breaks everything. And that moment came on a stormy Friday night, when the rain started early and the wind grew louder by the hour, and the whole house felt tense in a way I couldn't explain. And then around 8 o'clock, I heard Lily crying. Downstairs, not soft, not quiet, but loud, desperate. The kind of crying that demands attention, and I knew instantly something was about to happen. Then my father's voice cut through the noise, calling my name sharply, and I walked down the stairs already feeling that familiar weight in my chest, and when I stepped into the living room, I saw my mother holding Lily like she had been hurt, my father standing there with anger written across his face, and Lily looking up at me with tears in her eyes, but something else underneath, something cold, something calculated. And then she asked why I hated her, and I didn't even understand the question before she showed them messages, screenshots, words that looked like they came from me, cruel things about her, about a boy at school, about lies I had never said, and no matter how fast I tried to explain, no matter how desperately I told them it wasn't me, it didn't matter, because the moment she cried, they believed her. And when she showed the bruise on her arm, and said I had pushed her, I felt something inside me drop, like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet, and I said no, I never touched her, but my voice sounded weak even to me, and my father didn't hesitate. He looked at me like I was someone he didn't recognize and said something was wrong with me, said I was sick, and that word hit harder than anything else, because it wasn't just anger, it was rejection, it was final. And when he pointed to the door and told me to get out, I thought maybe, just maybe, I would stop him, maybe my mother would say enough, maybe someone would remember I was still their daughter, but no one moved, no one spoke, and when I asked where I was supposed to go, he said it wasn't his problem, and just like that I understood, I didn't belong there anymore, not even a little, and when I opened the door, the storm hit me full force, cold rain, sharp wind, and I stepped outside waiting for something to change, waiting for the door to open again, but it never did, and through the window I saw Lily watching me, and she wasn't crying anymore, she was smiling, and that was the moment everything inside me finally broke. Not loudly, not in a way anyone could see, but quietly, completely. I turned, walked away with no plan, no destination, just away from that house, from that version of myself that had spent years trying to be enough. The street was almost empty, the rain blurring everything into shadows, my phone buzzing with low battery. As I tried calling friends who didn't answer because they were home, safe, warm, loved, not like me, the wind pushing against me, the cold sinking deeper into my body with every step, and I kept walking because stopping felt worse, because going back wasn't an option anymore, and somewhere between one step and the next doubt started creeping in. What if they were right? What if something really was wrong with me? Why else would my own family choose her every single time? And I tried to shake the thought away, but loneliness has a way of making lies sound like truth. And by the time I reached the library and found it closed, dark, locked, I felt something heavier than fear settling inside me. So I kept moving toward the bus station, step after step through the storm, until suddenly everything changed. Headlights too bright, too close, a horn, a scream, tires skidding on wet pavement, and I tried to move, but my body was too slow and the impact came fast, violent, throwing me sideways, slamming me into the ground. Pain exploding through my head, the taste of blood mixing with rain as the world spun and sound faded, and then footsteps, a voice, panicked hands touching me gently, asking if I could hear her, telling me not to move. And I tried to speak, tried to hold on as everything slipped away. And when she asked about my parents, the words came out broken. They don't want me. And I saw something change in her face. Not just concern, but something deeper, something that understood. And she told me I wasn't alone, and I don't know why. But I believed her, even as darkness closed in, even as sirens echoed in the distance, and the last thing I felt was her hand holding mine, steady, warm, refusing to let go until everything disappeared. And when I finally came back, the world was different, not safe yet, not certain, but different, because for the first time someone had stayed. And when I finally came back to consciousness, the world didn't feel like mine anymore, because everything was too still, too clean, too controlled compared to the chaos of the storm I had just left behind. And for a moment, I didn't even remember where I was until the beeping sound beside me pulled me back into reality, and I realized I was lying in a hospital bed, my body heavy, my head throbbing with a dull, persistent pain that made it hard to think clearly. And when I tried to move even slightly, a wave of dizziness washed over me, forcing me to stay still, as fragments of memory began to return, slowly, painfully, the rain, the street, the headlights, the impact, and then her face, the woman who had been there when everything else fell apart. And before I could fully process anything, I heard her voice. Again, close this time, calm, steady, grounding, like something I could hold on to. She told me not to move, that I was safe now, that the doctors were taking care of me, and I didn't know why, but the word safe felt unfamiliar, like a language I had forgotten how to understand. Yet at the same time, I wanted to believe it so badly that I let myself sink into that moment, letting my body rest, because for the first time in a long time I wasn't fighting to be heard. I wasn't defending myself. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was just there, and someone stayed with me, not because they had to, but because they chose to, and that realization felt strange, almost painful in its own way, because it showed just how little I had been given before. And time passed in a blur, hours, or maybe days, I couldn't tell, because I kept drifting in and out of sleep, each time waking up a little more aware, a little more present, and every time I opened my eyes, she was still there, sometimes reading, sometimes talking, quietly with the nurses, sometimes just sitting beside me in silence, as if she understood that I didn't need questions, I didn't need pressure, I just needed space to exist without fear. And when I was finally awake long enough to focus on her face, clearly she introduced herself as Dr. Eleanor Bennett, and there was something about the way she spoke, not just confident, but certain, like she was used to being heard, used to being taken seriously, in a way I had never experienced before. And she didn't ask me what I did wrong. She didn't question my version of the story. She didn't look at me like I was a problem that needed to be fixed. Instead, she asked simple things: how I was feeling, if I was in pain, if I needed anything, and those questions felt so basic yet so unfamiliar that I didn't even know how to answer them at first, because no one had asked me what I needed in a very long time, and when I finally found my voice, I asked one question that had been sitting in my chest since I woke up: are they here? And she paused just long enough for me to understand the answer before she even said it. Your parents came, she said carefully, but they left, and something inside me tightened again, not as sharp as before, but still there, still real, and I nodded slowly, because a part of me had expected that outcome even before I asked, and she didn't push further. She didn't try to explain their behavior. She didn't defend them. She just stayed present in that moment, allowing me to feel what I needed to feel without turning it into something else. And that was the moment I realized she wasn't just helping me physically, she was giving me something I had never truly had before: the space to exist without being judged. And as the days went on, the doctors told me I had a concussion, that I needed rest, that I was lucky it wasn't worse. And every time someone said lucky, I found myself thinking about that word in a different way, because nothing about that night had felt like luck. But somehow I was still here, and maybe that meant something. Maybe it meant there was something left for me beyond everything I had lost. And one afternoon, while sunlight filtered softly through the hospital window and the storm felt like a distant memory, Dr. Bennett sat beside me and said something that changed everything. She told me I didn't have to go back there, not if I didn't want to. And at first I thought I had misunderstood, because going back was the only option I had ever imagined, even if it meant returning to the person said. Same pain, the same silence, the same feeling of not belonging. But she repeated it more clearly: this time, you have a choice. And those words felt heavier than anything else I had heard, because choice was something I had never really been given before. And when I asked where I would go if I didn't return, she didn't hesitate. She simply said, you can stay with me for now, until we figure things out together. And I stared at her, not fully understanding why someone who didn't know me, who had no obligation to me, would offer something so big, so life-changing. And when I asked why, she gave me an answer that stayed with me for the rest of my life, because someone once did the same for me. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Not hope, not yet, but something close to it, something fragile, something uncertain but real enough that I couldn't ignore it. And I realized that maybe, just maybe, my story didn't end on that night in the storm. Maybe it had just begun in a way I never expected. And from that moment, everything didn't magically become easy or perfect. The pain didn't disappear overnight. The memories didn't suddenly stop hurting, and there were still nights when I would wake up disoriented, my body tense, my mind replaying that moment at the door, hearing my father's voice telling me to leave as if I was something that didn't belong anywhere. But the difference now was that I wasn't facing it alone anymore, because every morning when I opened my eyes, there was a quiet kind of stability around me, something I had never experienced before. A space where I wasn't being compared, judged, or dismissed. A space where I could just exist without needing to prove my worth. And slowly, almost without realizing it, I began to change, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that anyone would notice immediately, but in the small, consistent ways that actually reshape a person. I started speaking a little more, asking questions without apologizing for them, allowing myself to be curious again about things I had once loved, like science, like learning, like imagining a future that felt like it could belong to me. And Dr. Bennett never pushed me faster than I could go. She never forced me to talk about what happened, but she never avoided it. Either she created this quiet balance where I knew I could say anything when I was ready, and that kind of patience did something to me. It made me feel safe enough to start trusting again, not just her, but the idea that not everyone in the world was waiting for me to fail or disappear. And as months passed, my life began to build itself into something new, something steady, something real. I transferred to a different school where no one knew my past, no one looked at me like I was a problem, and for the first time I wasn't carrying the weight of someone else's story about who I was. I was just Vera, a student who studied hard, who stayed after class, not because I was trying to escape home anymore, but because I actually wanted to learn, and that shift mattered. more than anything because it meant I wasn't surviving anymore. I was living, and Dr. Bennett showed me things I had never even imagined before. University campuses, research programs, conversations about ideas that actually shaped the world. And every time I hesitated, every time that old voice in my head told me I didn't belong, she would say something simple but powerful: "You do belong, you just haven't been in the right place before." And I held on to those words more than I realized at the time, because they slowly rewrote something deep inside me, the part that had believed for so long that I was the problem, that something about me was wrong. And as years passed, that belief started to lose its power, replaced by something stronger, something grounded in evidence, in the life I was building, in the prosody. Results I was achieving, in the people who were choosing to stay. And when I graduated at the top of my class, I didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone anymore because the proof was already there. In the quiet confidence that had replaced the fear, and in the life that no longer depended on being accepted by people who had once rejected me completely. And I continued forward into university, into work, into building something meaningful out of everything I had experienced, because pain doesn't disappear, but it can be transformed if you choose to do something with it. And that's how the idea came to me. The scholarship program for students who had been pushed aside, overlooked, dismissed, the ones who just needed someone to believe in them the way someone had believed in me. And it started small, just an idea, just a plan, just a few conversations, but over time, it grew into something real, something that helped dozens of students stay in school, stay alive, stay hopeful. And I didn't talk about my past publicly. I kept it simple, focused on the mission, focused on the impact, because it was never about revenge, it was about purpose. But life has a strange way of bringing things full circle when you least expect it. And one afternoon I was offered something I never thought I would face again: a chance to speak at a university graduation ceremony. And when I saw the name of the school, my chest tightened, because it was the same university my sister attended. And for a moment everything came rushing back: the storm, the door, the words, "I don't need a sick daughter like you." And I sat there staring at the invitation, knowing that I had a choice. I could walk away, I could protect myself from reopening that part of my life, or I could step into it on my own terms, not as the girl who was thrown out, but as the woman who had rebuilt herself completely. And I took a deep breath and said yes, not because I wanted to confront them, not because I needed their apology, but because I understood something I hadn't understood before. Closure isn't something other people give you. It's something you create when you decide your story no longer belongs to the past. And the day of the ceremony arrived faster than I expected. The campus filled with graduates, families, cameras, laughter, everything that once felt so far out of reach. And as I stood backstage waiting to be called, I could feel my heart beating faster, not out of fear but out of something deeper, something steady, something grounded. And when I stepped onto that stage and looked out into the crowd, I saw them: my father older, now my mother sitting beside him, and my sister in her graduation gown smiling until she saw me. And in that instant, everything changed. Her expression froze: confusion, then recognition, then something else, something she couldn't hide. And I walked to the podium calmly, not rushing, not hesitating. And when I spoke, my voice didn't shake, because I wasn't that girl anymore. I told the story not with anger, not with blame, but with truth. I spoke about a 15-year-old girl who was told she didn't belong, who was sent out into a storm, who was left to figure out her life alone. And then I spoke about the person who stopped, who stayed, who changed everything. And as the room fell silent, I said something that no one in that audience expected: that girl was me. And in that moment, the truth no longer needed to fight to be heard, because it stood on its own, clear, undeniable. And I looked at them not with hatred, not with pain, but with clarity, because I had already moved beyond the version of myself that needed anything from them. And I finished my speech with the only message that truly mattered: that your worth is not defined by who leaves you. It is defined by what you choose to become after they do. And the silence that followed was heavier than any applause, because it carried understanding, realization, consequences. And when the applause finally came, it wasn't for revenge. It wasn't for drama. It was for something deeper. something real. The recognition that even the most broken beginnings can lead to something meaningful if you refuse to let them define the end. And when the applause finally settled and the ceremony began to move forward, like nothing extraordinary had just happened, I stepped away from the podium slowly, not rushing, not looking back at first because I didn't need to see their reactions to understand what had just unfolded. The truth had already done its work quietly, completely, in a way no argument ever could, and as I walked off the stage, I felt something I had never felt before. Not victory, not relief, but a kind of calm certainty, the kind that comes when you realize you are no longer carrying something that once defined you, and for a moment, I simply stood backstage, breathing in that feeling, letting it settle into me, before I heard footsteps behind me, hesitant, uneven like, and someone unsure if they even had the right to come closer, and I didn't need to turn around to know who it was, because some things you recognize without seeing, and when I finally did turn, my father was standing there, older, smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in presence, as if time had taken something from him that he could never fully recover. And my mother stood beside him, her eyes red, her hands trembling slightly, and for a few seconds no one spoke, because there are moments when words feel too small for what needs to be said, and then my father. I tried to say something, anything, an apology, perhaps, or an explanation, but the words didn't come out the way he intended. They broke halfway, caught between pride, regret, and something that looked like fear. And my mother reached out as if she wanted to touch my arm, but stopped before she did, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to anymore. And I looked at them, not with anger, not with the need to confront or accuse, but with a clarity that made everything simple, in a way it had never been before. Because I understood something in that moment that had taken me years to learn. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reconnection, and closure doesn't always look like going back, and I told them quietly that I had already built a life, one that didn't include the version of me they had chosen to believe in that night, and that I didn't need anything from them anymore. Not explanations, not apologies, not even recognition, and my voice, I didn't shake, because I meant it fully, completely, and for the first time, heard me not as a child, not as someone they could dismiss, but as a person who had already moved beyond them. And my father lowered his eyes, and my mother finally let the tears fall, and I could see the weight of realization settling in, not the kind that can fix the past, but the kind that forces you to live with it. And for a moment I felt something unexpected, not pain, not anger, but a quiet sense of distance, like watching a chapter of a Clovis book I had already finished reading, and I knew then that there was nothing left there for me to return to. And when Lily stepped forward, her expression was different from what I had ever seen before. Not confident, not controlled, but uncertain, almost fragile, as if the version of reality she had built for so long had finally cracked. And she tried to speak, but the words were small, scattered, lacking the certainty she once had. And in that moment, I didn't see her as the person who had destroyed me. I saw her as someone who had built her life on something unstable, something that couldn't last forever, and I told her simply that the truth always finds its way out. Eventually, not to punish, but to reveal, and that what she chose to do with that truth now would define her future in the same way my choices had defined mine. And I didn't wait for a response because I didn't need one, and I turned and walked away, not out of anger but out of understanding, because some endings don't require a final conversation, they require a decision, and mine had already been made. And in the weeks that followed, the video of that speech spread far beyond that auditorium, reaching people I would never meet. Messages came from students, from parents, from people who had felt unseen, unheard, misunderstood, and they all said something similar, that hearing the story made them feel less alone. And that was the moment I realized something even more important than anything that had happened on that stage. The story was never just about me, it was about every person who had ever been told they weren't enough and chose to prove otherwise, not by fighting for validation, but by building something meaningful anyway. And the scholarship program grew not because of the attention, but because of the truth behind it. More students, more opportunities, more lives changed. And every time I met someone who reminded me of who I used to be, I told them the same thing that had once been told to me: you are not broken, you are just placed in the wrong environment, and when you find the right one, everything changes. And now, years later, when I think back to that night in the storm, I don't see it as the moment my life was destroyed. I see it as the moment it was redirected, because sometimes hardest experiences don't take everything from you. They strip away everything that was never meant to stay. And what remains is what you build your future on. And if there is one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this. Your worth is not decided by the people who fail to see it. It is decided by what you choose to do with the life you still have in front of you. And no matter where you are right now, no matter how alone you feel, there is always a moment where everything can begin again. I just have to survive long enough to reach it. And even after everything settled, after the speech, after the conversations that didn't need to happen, and the ones that never would, I realized something that stayed with me far longer than the applause, or the attention, or even the closure I thought I needed, because the truth is, closure doesn't feel like a single moment. It doesn't arrive like a clear ending. It happens slowly in quiet ways, in the way you stop replaying certain memories, in the way your body no longer reacts the same way when you prop in. Hear words that once broke you, and I began to notice those changes in myself in the weeks that followed, when I walked through my days, without that constant weight pressing against my chest, when I no longer felt the need to explain my past, to justify my existence, when I could simply be present in the life I had built without feeling like I was still running from something behind me. And that shift didn't erase what happened. It didn't make it okay, but it gave it a place, a boundary, something that no longer controlled me. And as the program continued to grow, I found myself sitting across from students who reminded me so much of who I used to be, not just in their stories, but in the way they spoke carefully, the way they apologized for things that didn't need apologies, the way they waited to be dismissed even when they were being invited to stay. And every time I saw that, I recognized it immediately, because I had lived it, and I would tell them the same thing I wish someone had told me earlier. That being overlooked doesn't mean you lack value. It often means you are surrounded by people who don't know how to see it, and when they looked at me, sometimes they didn't believe it at first, just like I wouldn't have believed it back then. But over time, something would shift in them too, just like it had shifted in me, and I realized that healing doesn't come from proving anything to the people who hurt you. It comes from building something so real, so steady, that their version of you simply no longer fits. And there were still moments when the past would surface unexpectedly, a certain tone of voice, a look. Someone gave me a situation that felt too familiar, and for a split second, I would be back there again, standing in that living room, hearing those words, feeling that same confusion, that same disbelief. But the difference now was that it didn't last. I could step out of it. I could remind myself that I wasn't that girl anymore, that I had already survived what I once thought would destroy me, and that awareness gave me a kind of strength that wasn't loud or visible, but constant and reliable, like something rooted deep beneath the surface. And over time, I stopped asking why it happened the way it did, because that question no longer led anywhere useful. Instead, I started asking what I was going to do with everything it had given me, and that question changed everything, because it shifted my focus from the past to the present, from what I had lost to what I was creating. And that's where real change happens, not in the moment of pain, but in the decisions that follow it. And one evening, after a long day of meetings and reviewing applications, I found myself sitting alone in my office long after everyone else had left the clations, building the city outside, quiet lights, reflecting in the window. And I thought about that 15-year-old girl again, not with sadness this time, but with something closer to respect, because she had kept going when she had every reason not to. She had walked into a storm without knowing if she would survive it. And somehow she did. And not only did she survive, she became someone who could stand on a stage and tell the truth without fear. And I realized then that strength doesn't always look like fighting. Sometimes it looks like enduring. Sometimes it looks like choosing not to become what hurt you. And that understanding changed the way I saw everything. Not just my past, but the people in it as well. Because for the first time, I didn't need them to be different. In order for me to be okay, I didn't need them to understand. I didn't need them to regret it in the way I once imagined, because I had already moved beyond the place where their actions defined me. And that freedom was something I had built myself piece by piece, choice by choice, until it became something no one could take away, and if there's anything I've learned through all of this, it's that the moment you stop waiting for someone else to fix what they broke is the moment you start building something stronger than what was lost. And that doesn't mean forgetting it, doesn't mean pretending it didn't matter. It means recognizing that your life is bigger than the moment that tried to end it and choosing to keep going. Anyway, and maybe that's the part people don't talk about enough. The quiet decision to continue, not because everything is okay, but because you are. And if you're listening to this right now, and there's a part of you that feels like you've been pushed aside, like you've been told, in ways big or small, that you don't belong, I want you to understand something clearly. That feeling is not the truth. It is a reflection of where you are, not who you are, and the moment you find the right environment, the right people, the right space to grow, everything can change in ways you can't even imagine yet. And it won't be instant, it won't be easy, but it will be real, and that matters more than anything else, because real change is what lasts. And as I left my office that night, turning off the lights and stepping into the quiet hallway, I didn't feel like someone who had something to prove anymore. I felt like someone who had already become what she needed to be. Not perfect, not untouched by the past, but whole in a way that didn't depend on anyone else. And for the first time, I understood that the story I had once thought was about rejection was actually about transformation, and that the storm I once believed had taken everything from me had in fact cleared the path for everything that came after. And as I stepped out into the night air that felt calm in a way the storm never had, I realized something that I wish I could go back and tell the girl I used to be: that the moment you think everything is ending is often the moment something else is beginning, even if you can't see it yet, even if it hurts too much to believe it at the time, because life doesn't always break you to destroy you. Sometimes it breaks you to rebuild you in a way that finally fits who you were meant to become. And if you are listening to this right now, and there is even a small part of you that feels unseen, unheard, or like you don't belong where you are, I want you to hold on just a little longer. Not because things will magically fix themselves, but because you have not yet reached the place where your life makes sense. And that place does exist, even if it feels far away. And even if no one around you can see your worth right now, that does not mean it isn't there. It simply means you are in the wrong environment, not in the wrong life. And if this story made you feel something real, if even one moment of it felt familiar or gave you a sense that you are not alone, then I want to hear your story too, because the truth is none of us are as alone as we think we are, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak even when your voice shakes. So if you've made it this far, thank you for staying with me. Thank you for listening. And if this story meant something to you in any way, don't forget to share your thoughts, because your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear next. And before you leave, I want to ask you something, not as a speaker, not as someone who has already made it through, but as someone who once stood exactly where you might be standing right now. Have you ever felt like you were trying so hard to be enough for people who had already decided you never would be? Because if you have, then you understand how quiet that kind of pain is, how invisible it can be, and how easy it is to start believing it even when it isn't true. And if there is one thing I hope you take with you after hearing all of this, it's that your life does not have to stay in the place where it was once broken. You are allowed to go beyond it. You are allowed to build something different, and you are allowed to leave behind the version of yourself that was shaped by survival and steps into the version that is built on choice. And if you feel ready, I would really love to hear where you are in your journey right now. Not where you think you should be, but where you actually are, because every story matters, even the ones that are still unfinished. And if this video stayed with you until this moment, that tells me something inside you connected with it, and that connection is important. So don't ignore it, don't push in it away, let it guide you, even if it's just one small step forward. And if you found value in this story in any way, whether it made you think, reflect, or simply feel understood, take a second to let me know, because your voice doesn't just support this channel, it helps a story reach someone else who might need it at the exact right time. And sometimes that's how everything changes, not through something big or dramatic, but through one story reaching one person at the moment they needed it most. And there is something else I didn't understand back then. Something that only became clear much later, when I started seeing the same patterns in other people's stories. The way pain repeats itself quietly across different lives. Different forms, but with the same core feeling of being unseen, of being unheard of, being made to believe that you are somehow less than what you truly are. And I used to think that what happened to me was something rare, something uniquely unfair, but the more people I met, the more I realized how common it actually is. Not the exact details, not the same storm, not the same words, but the same emotional weight carried by so many people who learned early on that love could be conditional, that acceptance could to be taken away, and that being yourself sometimes came with consequences, and that realization didn't make my story smaller, it made it more meaningful because it showed me that what I had gone through could actually serve a purpose. Beyond just surviving, it could become something that connected, something that reached people in a way nothing else could. And I began to pay attention to the small moments that used to go unnoticed, the way someone's voice changes when they finally feel safe enough to speak honestly, the way their posture shifts when they stop expecting to be rejected, the way their eyes hold a little more confidence, when they start believing that maybe, just maybe, they are allowed to take up space in the world, and those moments became more powerful than any achievement, any recognition, any external validation, because they represented something real, something lasting, something that couldn't be taken away, the way everything else once had been. And I realized that healing is not a straight path. It doesn't move forward in a perfect line. It circles back, it revisits old wounds, it tests you in ways you don't expect. And there were still days when I questioned myself, when old doubts surfaced without warning, when I caught myself shrinking. Again, in situations that felt too familiar, but the difference now was awareness. I could see it happening, I could stop it, I could choose differently, and that choice became the foundation of everything that came after, because once you realize that you are not stuck in the version of yourself that was shaped by pain, you begin to understand how much control you actually have over who you become next, and that realization is both empowering and overwhelming at the same time, because it removes the excuse that you are defined by your past and replaces it with the responsibility of deciding your future, and not everyone is ready for that. Not immediately, but over time, I learned to sit with that responsibility, to accept it not as pressure, but as possibility. And one of the most important shifts happened when I stopped measuring my life against what I had lost and started measuring it by what I was building instead, because loss will always feel heavy if you keep carrying it as the center of in your story. But when you place it behind you as something that shaped you rather than something that controls you, everything begins to change. And I think that's where a lot of people get stuck, not because they are weak, but because they are still standing too close to the moment that hurt them. They are still trying to understand it instead of stepping beyond it. And I know how difficult that is because I was there for a long time holding on to questions that had no answers, replaying scenarios that would never change, wishing for versions of people who were never going to exist. And it wasn't until I let go of that need for understanding that I finally found peace, not because everything made sense, but because I no longer needed it to. And that freedom is something I wish I could give to everyone who feels trapped in their own story. But the truth is, it's something you have to arrive at on your own, step by step, moment by moment, choice by choice. And if you're still in that place where things don't make sense, where the pain feels too close, where the future feels uncertain, I want you to know that it's okay to be there for now. It's okay to not have all the answers yet, because clarity doesn't come from forcing to yourself to understand everything. It comes from continuing to move forward even when you don't. And one day, you will look back and realize that the version of you who thought they couldn't survive was actually stronger than they ever knew. And that strength wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It didn't show up in dramatic ways. It showed up in the quiet decision to keep going, to keep breathing, to keep choosing life, even when it didn't feel like it was choosing you back. And that is something worth recognizing, something worth respecting, something worth holding on to, because it means you are already further along than you think you are, and maybe that's where real transformation begins. Not in the moment everything changes, but in the realization that you already have the ability to change everything moving forward. And even now, there are moments when I find myself pausing in the middle of an ordinary day for no clear reason at all. Maybe it's the way the light hits a window, or the sound of rain starting softly outside, or the way someone laughs. Without hesitation, and in those small unexpected seconds, I feel the less distance between who I was and who I have become. Not as something dramatic, but as something quiet and undeniable, like looking at two versions of the same life that could have gone in completely different directions. And I sometimes wonder what would have happened if that night had gone differently, if the door had opened again, if someone had called my name, if I had stayed instead of walking away. But the more I think about it, the more I understand that those questions no longer carry the same weight, because the life I have now is not built on what almost happened. It is built on what I chose to do after everything fell apart. And that distinction matters more than anything, because it means that even in the worst moments, even when you feel like you have no control, there is still a point where your choices begin to shape what comes next. And I think that's something many people don't realize when they are still inside their hardest chapter. They believe that everything has already been decided, that the way things are is the way they will always be, but that isn't true. The truth is that change rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive as a clear turning point. It builds quietly through small decisions, through moments when you choose to keep going, when you choose not to believe the worst things you have been told about yourself, when you choose to trust, even if it feels uncomfortable, even if it feels unfamiliar, and over time, those choices create a path that didn't exist before. And I know that because I lived it, I didn't wake up one day, suddenly strong, suddenly confident, suddenly healed. I became that person gradually, through repetition, through effort, through the willingness to try again, even after setbacks, even after doubt, even after moments when it would have been easier to give up. And that process taught me something that no one had ever explained to me before: that strength is not something you either have or you don't. It is something you build in the way you respond to what life gives you. And sometimes life gives you things you never asked for, things you don't deserve, things that seem unfair in ways you can't justify. But even then, there is still something within your reach. There is still a direction you can move toward, even if it is only one small step at a time. And those steps matter more than you think, because they are what separate the version of you that stays stuck from the version of you that moves forward. And when I meet people now who are still in that place, who are still trying to make sense of something that hurt them, I don't try to give them perfect answers. I don't tell them everything will be okay, because I know how empty that can sound. Instead, I tell them the truth, that it might not be okay right now, and that's real, but it also doesn't have to stay that way. And the difference between those two realities is not luck, it is not timing, it is the choices you make, the moments when no one else is watching, when no one is telling you what to do, when you have to decide for yourself whether you are going to keep going or not. And I think back often to the version of me who stood in the rain that night, cold, exhausted, convinced that there was nowhere left to go. And if I could speak to her now, I wouldn't try to explain everything that would happen. I wouldn't overwhelm her with the future. I would simply tell her to take one more step, and then another, and then another, because that is how everything changed. Not all at once, but piece by piece, until the life she thought she had lost was replaced by one she never imagined possible. And maybe that's the part of this story that matters the most. Not the pain, not the rejection, not even the turning point, but the continuation, the decision to keep moving, even when it doesn't feel like progress. Because progress is not always visible. Sometimes it is happening beneath the surface. Sometimes it is building in ways you can't measure yet. And one day you will look back and realize that you have moved further than you ever thought you could, and that the person you became along the way is stronger, wiser, and more complete than the one who started. And if you're still at the beginning of that process, if you're still standing in your own version of that storm, I want you to remember this. You don't need to see the entire path ahead of you. You only need enough strength to take the next step, and then trust that the rest will come in time. And as time continued to move forward in ways that once felt impossible to imagine, I found myself paying closer attention not just to what I was building, but to how I was experiencing it, because for so long my life had been about surviving, about getting through the next moment, the next day, the situation without breaking. and I hadn't really learned how to live in a way that allowed me to feel present in what was happening around me, and that shift didn't happen all at once. It came in small, realizations scattered across ordinary days, moments where I caught myself no longer bracing for something to go wrong, no longer expecting to be dismissed or misunderstood in the same way I once had, and those moments felt unfamiliar at first. First, almost uncomfortable, because when you've lived in a constant state of emotional tension for so long, calm can feel like something you don't quite trust yet. And I remember one afternoon sitting in a quiet cafe, watching people come and go, and realizing that for the first time I wasn't comparing myself to anyone else. I wasn't measuring my worth based on how I was being treated. I was simply observing existing breathing. And that might sound like something small, something insignificant. But for me, it represented a shift so fundamental that it changed the way I understood my own life, because I was no longer reacting to what had happened to me. I was actively shaping what was happening next, and that distinction matters more than most people realize because it is the difference between living in response to your past and living with intention toward your future. And as that awareness grew, I began to notice patterns not just in myself, but in the world around me, the way people carry their experiences, the way unresolved pain shows up in subtle behaviors and guarded expressions in hesitation and withdrawal. And I started to understand that many of the things I once took personally were never really about me at all. They were reflections of what other people were carrying, of what they hadn't processed, of what they didn't know how to express in a healthy way, and that realization didn't excuse what happened. It didn't erase the impact, but it gave me perspective. And with the perspective came a different kind of freedom. The freedom to stop internalizing everything, the freedom to separate my identity from other people's actions. And that was something I had never fully understood before, because when you grow up being blamed for things that aren't yours, start to believe that everything is yours to carry, and it takes time to unlearn that. It takes awareness and repetition and patience with yourself. In moments when the old patterns try to pull you back into familiar reactions, but slowly, steadily, that weight begins to lift, and in its place, something else grows, something quieter, but stronger, something rooted in self-trust and self-understanding, and that is what allowed me to continue moving forward, even in moments of uncertainty, because life doesn't stop presenting challenges just because you've healed from one part of it. There are always new situations, new decisions, new directions that require you to show up in ways you haven't before, and there were times when I questioned whether I was ready for those next steps, whether I was capable of handling the responsibility that came with the life I was building, but each time that doubt appeared, I had something now that I didn't have. Before I had evidence, I had proof of what I had already survived, of what I had already created, and that made it possible to move forward, not with complete certainty, but with enough confidence to take the next step and trust that I would figure it out along the way, and that trust in myself became one of the most valuable things I gained through everything I had been through, because it meant that even if circumstances changed, even if things didn't go as planned, I would still be able to adapt, to adjust, to continue, and that is something no one can take from you once you have built it. And as the years passed and the work I was doing continued to expand, I found myself in more spaces where I was asked to share not just what I had accomplished but how I had gotten there, and each time I told my story, I made a conscious decision not to tell it in a way that focused only on the pain, not to center it around what had been done to me, but to frame it around what I had done with it, because that is where the power is, not in the experience itself, but in the transformation that follows. And I began to see how that shift affected the way people received it, because when you focus only on what went wrong, people may feel sympathy, but when you show them what is possible afterward, they feel something much deeper. They feel hope. They feel possibility. They see a reflection of what they might be able to do in their own lives, and that is what creates real impact, not just telling a story, but allowing it to become something that extends beyond you and into the lives of others. And there were moments when I wondered if my past would always be tied to everything I did, if it would always be part of how people saw me. But over time, I realized that while it will always be part of my story, it is no longer the part that defines me. It is simply one chapter among many. And that distinction gave me a sense of ownership over my narrative that I had never had before, because it meant that I was no longer limited to the role I had been placed in. I was the one deciding what came next, and that is a level of freedom that changes everything because it allows you to move through life, not as someone reacting to circumstances, but as someone actively shaping them. And as I look back now, I can see how each step, even the painful ones, contributed to where I am not, in a way that justifies them, but in a way that shows how they were transformed into something else, something that no longer holds the same power over me. And that is something I want you to understand. As well, whatever you are carrying, whatever you have been through, it does not have to remain in the same form. It can change, it can evolve, it can become something that supports you rather than something that holds you back. But that shift requires a willingness to see yourself differently, to step outside the version of yourself that was shaped by those experiences and begin building something new. And that process takes time. It takes effort and it takes moments of doubt where you question whether you are really capable of becoming that person. But every time you choose to move forward anyway, every time you take a step, even when you are unsure, you are reinforcing a new version of yourself, one that is not defined by what happened, but by what you choose to do next. And that is where your real power lies, not in controlling everything that happens to you, but in deciding how you respond to it and what direction you move in afterward. And if there is anything I have learned, it is that direction matters more than speed. You don't have to have everything figured out right away. You don't have to move quickly. You just have to keep moving in a way that aligns with the life you want to build. And over time, those small, consistent steps create something far greater than any single moment ever could. And maybe that is the most important part of all of this. The understanding that your life is not determined by one night, one decision, one moment of rejection. It is shaped by everything that comes after, and your willingness to continue, even when it would be easier not to. And that is something no one else can decide for you. It is something only you can choose. And once you do that, choice becomes the beginning of everything that follows. And there came a point much later when I realized that the Harji life I had built was no longer something fragile that could be taken away by someone else's opinion, or by a moment of doubt, or by memories that once had the power to define me. And that realization didn't arrive suddenly. It grew quietly over time, in the way I handled difficult conversations, in the way I responded to unexpected setbacks, in the way I no longer felt the need to justify who I was to people who had not earned the right to understand me. And I remember one specific evening standing alone after an event where I had just spoken to a group of students, many of them carrying stories similar to mine, and as they came up to talk to me one by one, I noticed something that stayed with me far longer than the event itself. It was the look in their eyes, not just gratitude but recognition, as if they were seeing a version of themselves reflected in what I had shared. And in that moment I understood something that had taken years to fully accept, that my story was no longer just something that belonged to me. It had become something that could reach beyond me, something that could exist in the space between people, where understanding is formed not through explanation, but through shared experience. And that realization carried a kind of responsibility with it, not a burden, but a purpose, because once you understand that your voice can make someone else feel less alone, you can't ignore that, you can't pretend it doesn't matter. And so I continued to show up in those spaces, not as someone who had everything figured out, but as someone who was still learning, still growing, still navigating the complexities of a life that had not been simple but had become meaningful in ways I never expected. And through that process, I began to see how resilience is not just about surviving difficult situations, it is about what you choose to create after them. It is about the ability to take something that once caused you pain and turn it into something that supports not only you but others. Well, and that transformation doesn't erase what happened, but it changes its role in your life. It shifts it from being a source of limitation to becoming a source of strength and insight. And that shift is what allows you to move forward without being held back by what once defined you. And there were still times when I felt the weight of everything I had experienced, especially in quiet moments when there was nothing to distract me from my own thoughts. But even in those moments, there was a difference. The weight no longer felt like something that would pull me down. It felt like something I could carry, something that had become part of me without controlling me. And that distinction is important, because it marks the point where healing becomes integration, where your past is no longer something separate that you are trying to escape from, but something that exists within you as part of your story, without limiting your future. And I think that is something many people struggle to reach, not because they are incapable, but because they are still trying to separate themselves from what they have experienced instead of learning how to carry it in a way that allows them to move forward. And that process takes time. It requires honesty with yourself. It requires the willingness to face things that are uncomfortable and to sit with emotions that don't have easy answers. But through that process, something changes, something stabilizes, something becomes clearer, and once that clarity is there, it becomes much harder for anything outside of you to shake your sense of who you are. And that is when you begin to experience a different kind of freedom, not the kind that comes from escaping your past, but the kind that comes from no longer being controlled by it, and that freedom allows you to move through life with a sense of direction that is not dependent on external validation or approval, because you have already built something within yourself that is steady enough to support you regardless of what happens around you. And as I continued forward, I began to understand that the most meaningful parts of my life were not the moments of recognition or success, but the quiet, consistent choices I made every day, the decision to show up, the decision to keep learning, the decision to remain open even when it would have been easier to close myself off, and those choices accumulated over time into something that felt solid, something that felt real in a way that external achievements never fully could, and that realization changed the way I approached everything, because it shifted my focus from outcomes to process, from what I was achieving to how I was living, and that shift created a sense of stability that I had never experienced before, because it was no longer tied to things that could be taken away. It was built on something internal, something that I had developed through everything I had been through, and that is what allowed me to continue growing without feeling like I had to prove anything to anyone, because the life I was living had already become the proof, not in a way that needed to be displayed or defended, but in a way that was simply evident in how I moved through the world and interacted with others. And I think that is ultimately what healing leads to. Not perfection, not a life without challenges, but a way of being that is grounded, that is resilient, that is capable of adapting to whatever comes next without losing itself in the process. And if there is one thing I have come to understand through all of this, it is that your past may shape you, but it does not have to define you unless you allow it to. And the moment you recognize that difference is the moment you begin to take back control over your own story, not by changing what has already happened, but by changing how it influences what comes next. And that is where real transformation takes place, not in rewriting the past, but in reclaiming your peace, future, and choosing to move forward in a way that reflects who you have become, rather than who you once were. And that choice is available to you at any point, no matter where you are in your journey, no matter how far you feel from where you want to be. Because change does not require you to be ready, it only requires you to begin. And once you do that, everything else follows step by step, moment by moment, until one day you realize that you are no longer trying to escape your life, you are living it fully, completely, and on your own terms.